Here's a quick recap of Google's official presentation about consent mode update they held for the e-commerces and then all the businesses basically that operate online in European Economic Area. Google opened the presentation by speaking about how important it is to collect user consent and to do it preferably via one of the Google partner consent management platforms. Then they continued talking that if you're using Universal Analytics 360, you should migrate to Google Analytics 4, and how you should leverage consent mode and optionally upgrade Google APIs to pass consent signals for offline data. And they added a footnote that you should do it before March 2024. But if I was to structure this presentation, I would say like this: what you need to do before March 2024 in order to preserve audience features. Now, to recap briefly, what is consent mode? Well, it's a tool that communicates user consent choices to Google Tags SDK so that they can adjust their behavior accordingly. Basically, you pass consent of your website visitors to Google, and then Google knows whether they are allowed to track these people and then pass this data over to Google Ads or not. So what's changing? Google is introducing two new parameters. So far we had analytics storage and then ad storage that in the basic consent mode defined what data is your website allowed to share with Google platforms. Now Google is introducing two new parameters, ad user data and ad personalization, and they give more fine-tuning control over what's to be shared with Google, as you will see in the upcoming slides. How does it work? User navigates to your website. Consent mode will communicate consent status, and if consent is granted for all, Google will observe data as normal. They say as normal, but they actually mean the way that they did observe so far. If consent is denied for one or more parameters, then Google will adjust how their tags work and basically what behavior do they track and what they share across other Google platforms. This is how basic consent mode works and how it worked so far. If a user visits your website and then denies consent on the banner, tags do not fire and tracking stops completely. Whereas if the user consents, basically everything works as normal, to put it the way Google puts it. With advanced consent mode, if the user denies on the consent banner that they do not want to be tracked, Google will still pass some data which will be, according to their promise, dropped immediately and not stored anywhere, but they still, as they put it, tags/SDK will adjust behavior to respect the consent status. So they do not explicitly say that they will stop tracking, they just say that they will respect consent choice. You will see shortly what does that mean for your tracking. So why is Google Ads consent modeling important? Basically, all those visitors that perform some kind of a desired behavior on your website, you want to be able to trace that back to the source that brought that visit in order to evaluate your campaigns or your marketing efforts in general. Without consent mode, and please pay attention closely to the numbers that we see here, out of 100 users coming from campaign A, if 10 of them convert, you have a 10% conversion rate regardless of the fact if you know the consent or not. For campaign B, and looking at the same numbers, you will practically give equal credit to each one of these two campaigns because you see these two campaigns equally. Now with consent mode, in campaign A, we had 100 users, but this time we have 12 conversions, which obviously straight off the bat give us higher conversion rate, and this looks better. But if we go deeper into the detail that Google wanted to explain in this presentation, they say that with advanced consent mode being implemented, they will be able to model these 30 people who declined consent. And if they had 7% conversion rate, when you compare this campaign to campaign B, where you have less users give consent at the beginning of their session, you see 60 users gave consent versus 40 who declined. And comparing to the campaign A, we saw 70 to 30. But with the modeling that's enabled in advanced consent mode, Google understands that out of these 40 people, 6 of them converted. So your conversion rate overall is way higher in campaign B, even though the user consent is not given equally in these two campaigns. Now, I find this comparison somewhat to be the fallacy if you compare it with this one. Number one, because we have less users convert overall, and then also the modeling here is completely arbitrary, and it's actually, these numbers are skewed to fit whatever Google was trying to explain to us. So what does Google use for modeling? Device type, conversion type, country, time of day, and browser type. Individually, you should be able to, even at a glance, understand what do these parameters mean for evaluating your campaigns and conversions. So it depends probably on the type of the business and the region that you operate in, and these other factors that actually go into understanding whether this is important for your conversions or not. Here is what they promise to use with the Google modeling. With basic consent mode, they estimate number of unconsented ad clicks, because it's important to understand here that with basic consent mode, tracking does not even fire if a user denies consent on the banner. With advanced consent mode, the tracking actually does fire, whereas it does not store, or Google promises not to store the data. And we advise you to check this with your legal team first and foremost before you implement advanced tracking consent mode, because obviously it may have future legal implications on your business. So to recap quickly before we wrap it up, this applies to businesses who operate in European Economic Area. So regardless of the fact if your business is seated in the EU itself, if you have people visiting from this area, this applies to you. Consent banner should be implemented that respects user choices, and you need to tag your website all across the board. And the last reminder is to try to use Google Partner CMP platform, or if you're doing custom implementation of consent mode, make sure to do it according to Google official policies. Thank you for watching, and I hope that this video is useful for your business.